22 years I kept the marble at the Aranth Frontier Embassy. I knew every vein in that stone. The copper thread that ran from the east gallery to the stairwell. The pale streak near the south window that looked like a river delta if you caught it in the afternoon light. I knew which cleanser went on which floor, and how long to let it sit. I knew the marble the way most people know their own skin. That's why I stayed. Not bravery, not compassion, not some grand gesture against an evacuation order. The war dragon came through the east gallery wall on a Tuesday afternoon, trailing smoke and blood and half a wing, and by the time the embassy staff had cleared the building, scrambling past me in the corridor, shouting about shelters and protocol and secondary strikes, the blood was already pooling between the tiles and settling into the grout lines. You don't leave blood in marble grout, not if you've spent 22 years keeping it out. His name was Calveth. I didn't know that then. I didn't know anything then, except that he was enormous. Iron-black scales with deep copper ridging along his spine, one wing folded wrong beneath him, the other shredded to translucent membrane, and a wound across his chest that looked like it had been cauterized by his own failing fire and torn open again when he hit my floor. He was breathing in long, shuddering pulls that fogged the stone. His eyes were shut. His claws had gouged 4 channels in the marble where he'd tried to drag himself further inside, and the channels ran all the way to the stairwell base. I started with the blood. I mopped a wide perimeter first, where the pooling had spread thinnest, then worked inward, wringing into the bucket, changing the water 3 times. When I got close enough to smell him, forge metal and copper and something older, his eye opened. One eye, gold, slit-pupilled, the size of my closed fist. He watched me wring out the mop. I said, "You're on my floor." He closed his eye. By evening, I'd cleaned the blood from the marble and started on the wound. I didn't know dragon medicine, but I knew what soap and water could do, and I knew that a wound left sitting in its own discharge turns bad whether it belongs to a diplomat or a war dragon. So I tore up the reception hall tablecloths, the ones with the embroidered crest, and I washed the burned edges of the gash with warm water, and I packed clean linen into the parts that were still open, and I held it there until my shoulders locked. He didn't flinch. He didn't growl. He lay still under my hands, the way a thing does when it has forgotten what gentleness feels like, and can't remember how to respond to it. I slept in the supply closet that night, on a stack of clean dust cloths, with the door propped open so I could hear if his breathing changed. In the morning I brought water. I didn't have a trough or a basin big enough, so I used the floor wash bucket, scrubbed first, filled fresh from the kitchen. I set it near his jaw. He didn't drink. I went back to mopping the corridor outside the gallery, where boot prints from the evacuation had tracked in grit. 2 hours later, the bucket was empty, and his mouth was wet, so I filled it again and didn't say anything about it. On the second day, my supervisor called on the intercom from the emergency shelter. She told me the building was condemned, that Therath military operations were being routed around the district, and that I was dismissed effective immediately if I didn't report to the shelter within the hour. I unplugged the intercom. It wasn't that I didn't hear her, but Calveth's wound had started seeping again overnight, and the fresh blood was running into the channels his claws had gouged, and if I didn't stay on top of it, the stain would set into stone. I'd spent 2 decades keeping clean. I changed his dressings. I brought more water. I ate crackers from the kitchen pantry and drank embassy tea and mopped the same 30 square meters of gallery floor 4 times a day, and each time it dried clean, I felt something that had nothing to do with bravery and everything to do with a job done right. On the 3rd evening he rumbled when I came in with fresh linen. Low, deep, a vibration I felt in the floor before I heard it. Not a warning. Something else, like a building settling into its foundation after a long strain. I changed the dressing and he held still, and when I pressed the clean cloth flat against the wound he exhaled once, slowly, and the warmth of his breath dried my sleeve where it had gotten wet from the wash water. I put my hand on the ridge above his eye, just for a moment. The scale there was smooth and warm. He didn't pull away. On the fourth morning I sat down beside him, because my knees wouldn't hold me anymore. I'd been sleeping in 2-hour blocks, eating standing up, hauling water up and down the service stairs because the gallery tap had been shattered in the impact. My hands were cracked from wringing linen. My back had locked into one solid ache on the third day and hadn't let go. I sat with my back against his side, in the warm hollow between his foreleg and shoulder, and I felt his breathing move me. Slow in, slow out. The marble beneath us was warm from his body heat. I said, "You'd better live. I used all the good tablecloths." He rumbled. I closed my eyes. When I opened them, the light was different. Late morning, the sun full in the gallery windows. I'd been out for hours, and the gallery was full of dragons. 6 of them. Thereth war escort, iron gold scales, ridged and scarred, carrying themselves with the quiet weight of creatures who had outlived everything that tried to kill them. They stood in a half circle around the broken wall, heads lowered, wings folded, absolutely still. And behind them, framed in the breach itself where the morning light poured through, stood the Therath commandant. I knew what she was, the way you know a cathedral is a cathedral, not from any single feature, but from the sheer fact of her. Iron gold and copper dark, her scales worn to a mat that absorbed the daylight without giving any back. Her head was level with the second-floor windows. Her eyes were the color of old amber held up to a fire. She was looking at the floor. I sat there, back against her dying warrior, cracked hands wrapped in strips of curtain fabric because I'd run out of proper bandages 2 days ago, a mop across my lap, and I watched her gaze move across the marble, every tile, every grout line, every one of the 30 square meters I'd been cleaning for 4 days. The blood was gone, the stone was buffed, the embassy crest tablecloths were in ruins, but the floor was immaculate. She looked at the floor. Then she looked at the wound. Clean, packed, dressed, no longer seeping. Then she looked at me. I said, "I'll need a requisition form for the curtains." Something shifted behind her eyes. Not amusement, not gratitude. Something older than either. The look of a creature seeing a thing she had stopped expecting to find in the world. She spoke one word, low, in Therath, directed at Calveth. And Calveth, who had not said a word in 4 days, not when I washed his wound, not when I mopped around him at 3 in the morning, not when I fell asleep against the warm wall of his ribs, opened both eyes and said my name. Not Amma. Something in Therath that I felt in my chest, more than heard in my ears. A sound that carried in it 22 years of marble and warm water, and hands that would not stop working. The commandant dipped her head. Once. The Therath don't bow. I learned that later. What she did was something smaller and older, an acknowledgement. The 6 escort followed, heads lowering together, like a current passing through them. They took Calveth that afternoon on a Therath medical carrier. Slow, careful, the escort walking alongside. He went without sound. As they lifted him past me, his tail swept the gallery floor once, across the spot where I'd been sitting, and left a single scale wedged in the grout. Copper dark, still warm. I picked it up. A week later, a formal Therath communication arrived at the embassy's interim office. My supervisor called me, her voice careful now, reading from something, and told me my position had been reinstated with full seniority, that the gallery would be rebuilt at Therath expense, and that I was to be, in the commandant's phrasing, undisturbed in the execution of her work. I went back on a Monday. New tablecloths, new curtains, the wall rebuilt, the marble reset where the damage had been worst. The Therath masonry detail had matched the stone almost perfectly, but they'd left one gouge unrepaired, the deepest channel, nearest the stairwell, where his claws had dug in the moment he crashed. It was clean. I'd cleaned it myself, day 1, on my knees with a toothbrush. I keep the scale in my apron pocket. It hasn't cooled. Not once. Not the warm kind of warm that fades, but the kind that holds, the way good marble holds the sun long after the light moves on. Every quarter, a Therath courier lands on the embassy roof and leaves a wrapped parcel on the gallery windowsill. I've never opened one where anyone could see. I mop around them,